U.S. Congress just witnessed one of the most shocking hearings of the year, and the name shaking up public discourse is Jasmine Crockett, the unrelenting Congresswoman from Texas. In just a few minutes, she tore apart the leadership facade of Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary under Trump, leaving the entire room in stunned silence. Evidence, misconduct, and incompetence were laid bare in front of millions of television viewers. And the result, Pete Hegseth was ousted from Congress. No more excuses. No one left to blame. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Under the glaring lights of the House Oversight and Accountability Committee hearing room, the atmosphere was as tense as a taut string about to snap. Lawmakers, reporters, and spectators packed the room, their eyes fixed on the two central figures, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic star from Texas, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, facing serious allegations. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, holding a thick stack of documents, the chandelier light illuminating her face, resolute and sharp as a blade. The silence in the hearing room grew stifling as she began her questioning. Across from her, Pete Hegseth sat uneasily, fingers tapping lightly on the table, trying to maintain a calm demeanor, but with eyes betraying his tension. The cameras panned slowly, capturing every moment of the dramatic confrontation. As the nation watched, with bated breath, Crockett placed the documents on the table, her voice, low but razor-sharp, echoing through the room. Mr. Hegseth, let's start with your gravest mistake, the suspension of military aid to Ukraine. You ordered the halt of critical weapons shipments, leaving Ukrainian soldiers facing Russian forces without ammunition or equipment. Millions of American taxpayer dollars were wasted, and our nation's credibility was damaged. How do you explain this decision? Hegseth cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. I acted based on what I understood to be President Trump's priorities to protect America's interests, he replied, his voice steady, more like a Fox News host than a defense secretary. We cannot keep pouring money into foreign wars without reassessment. Crockett tilted her head, a faint, mocking smile on her lips. Reassessment? Sir, this isn't a strategy meeting on TV. This is national security. She opened the stack of documents, pulling out a printed email, a compelling piece of evidence. This is an email from a senior Pentagon official, sent to your team right after you ordered the aid suspension. It reads, "We don't understand why the secretary acted without clear direction from the president. Can you explain why you made this decision unilaterally? Or were you just guessing?" The hearing room erupted in murmurs. Some Republican lawmakers frowned, while Democrats nodded in approval. Hegseth clenched his fists, a flash of anger in his eyes. "That's a misrepresentation," he retorted, his voice higher than usual. "I acted based on the information available at the time. And I'd like to point out that the aid was resumed shortly after, proving no lasting damage was done." Crockett didn't let him off. She stepped closer to the podium, her voice lowering, each word piercing Hegseth. "No lasting damage. Sir, Ukrainian soldiers died due to the lack of weapons. Our allies in Europe questioned America's commitment, and you call that no damage." She paused, letting the silence underscore her accusation. "Tell me, Mr. Hegseth, if it wasn't a mistake, why was the aid resumed just 3 days later? Who fixed your error?" Hegseth's face reddened, clearly cornered. We adjusted based on new information," he stammered, trying to regain control. "I'm not in the habit of discussing internal details here," but his voice lacked conviction, and the audience began whispering. A Democratic lawmaker in the back row chuckled softly, while Chairman James Comer had to tap his gavel to restore order. Crockett didn't stop. She held up another document, this time an internal Pentagon report. This report shows you not only misunderstood President Trump's intentions, but also ignored advice from top military advisors. They warned you that stopping the aid would have catastrophic consequences. Yet you proceeded. Why, Mr. Hegseth? Were you deliberately acting to serve some political agenda? The question left the hearing room dead silent. Hegseth opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked down at the table, his fingers no longer tapping, as if searching for a way out of the trap Crockett had set. "I had no intention of harming national security," he finally said, his voice feeble. "Every decision I made was for America's best interests." Crockett shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "America's interests aren't a political game, sir, and they're certainly not a prop for you to use on Fox News." She turned to the lawmakers, her voice growing stronger. We cannot allow someone so incompetent to continue holding power at the Pentagon. This mistake isn't just a personal error. It's a threat to global security. The audience applauded, despite Comer's stern look. Hegseth bowed his head, sweat beading on his forehead. Crockett set the documents down, her eyes still locked on him, as if to say, this is just the beginning. The confrontation had turned from a hearing into a public battle, and Hegseth was losing ground. The cameras panned across his face, capturing his growing unease, while Crockett stood there, ready for the next round of questioning. Crockett placed her hand on a new stack of documents, her voice calm but brimming with explosive power. Mr. Hegseth, we've seen your failure in managing defense policies. Now let's talk about your leadership, or rather, the lack thereof. She paused, letting the words sink into the air. You fired Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chairman C.Q. Brown and Navy Commander Lisa Franchetti, two of our finest military leaders, without providing any convincing reason. Can you explain why? Hegseth took a deep breath, trying to regain control. I acted in the best interests of the military, to ensure we have leaders aligned with the president's vision, he replied, his voice striving for calm but his eyes wavering. The military needs innovation, and I made the necessary decisions. Crockett raised an eyebrow, a scornful smile flickering. Innovation. Sir, firing two top leaders without a replacement plan isn't innovation. It's chaos. She flipped a page in her documents, her voice turning icy. I have here testimony from a veteran admiral, someone you tried to recruit as the new Navy commander. He declined. And why? He said the Pentagon under your leadership is a war zone no one wants to step into. How do you explain military leaders refusing to work with you? The hearing room buzzed with whispers. Some Republican lawmakers looked down, visibly uncomfortable, while Democrats exchanged approving glances. Hegseth tightened his fists, his voice turning sharp. I'm unaware of any such refusal. What you're saying is speculation, not fact. We're in the process of selecting the right people, and I'll announce nominations when the time comes. The time comes. Crockett interrupted, her voice like a whip. Sir, it's been nearly 4 months since Miss Franchetti was fired, and the Navy commander's seat remains empty. You call that effective management? She held up an internal report, her voice filled with accusation. This report, provided by a former Pentagon official, shows you ignored recommendations from the Joint Chiefs to retain Mr. Brown and Miss Franchetti. Instead, you fired them without consultation, leaving the military in disarray. Do you have any comment? Hegseth opened his mouth, but only a choked sound emerged. He glanced at the Republican lawmakers, as if seeking rescue, but none spoke up. I made decisions based on what I thought was best.
He said, his voice noticeably weaker. We need strong leaders, unbound by old thinking.
Crockett stepped closer to the podium, her gaze piercing through him.
Strong? Mr. Brown is a war hero, respected across the military.
Miss Franchetti was the first woman to lead the Navy, a symbol of progress, and you fired them for old thinking.
Or because you didn't want anyone challenging your authority.
Her question silenced the room, with only the sound of the audience's sharp breaths. Some clapped softly, despite Comer's gavel warning. Hegseth tried to counter, his voice trembling.
You're distorting the truth. I didn't discriminate against anyone.
I only wanted to ensure the military serves the president's goals, but his words lacked conviction, and the audience began to murmur, sensing the faltering in his argument. Crockett didn't relent. She placed her hand on the podium, her voice slow but weighty.
Mr. Hegseth, if you didn't discriminate, why do internal reports show you targeted Mr. Brown? Because he is a person of color, and Miss Franchetti, because she is a woman.
Why haven't you provided any evidence to defend your decisions? She paused, letting the question hang like a verdict. A true defense secretary would build a team, not destroy it. You've turned the Pentagon into a mess, and you owe this nation an explanation. The atmosphere in the House Oversight and Accountability Committee hearing room was heavy, like the calm before a storm. Jasmine Crockett stood firm, her eyes never leaving Pete Hegseth, who was trying to mask his panic behind a crumbling veneer of confidence. After exposing his mistakes on Ukraine aid and his weak leadership, Crockett shifted to a new issue, her voice like a hammer, ready to crush any remaining excuses. Hegseth, his face rigid, felt the mounting pressure, while the audience and lawmakers awaited her next move. The television cameras panned across, capturing the tension enveloping the room. Crockett picked up another stack of documents, her fingers lightly tracing the pages like a strategist preparing to deploy her final weapon. Hegseth, she began, her voice calm but laced with undeniable accusation.
You've thrown the military into chaos.
But what's even more concerning is how you've handled the defense budget, or rather, how you've squandered it. She looked up, locking eyes with Hegseth. You missed the deadline to submit the budget draft to Congress, leaving us unable to pass critical legislation to ensure military funding. Do you realize this has put essential defense programs at risk of delay? Hegseth took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. We're working to optimize the budget, he replied, his voice attempting authority, but tinged with defensiveness. I focused on America's priorities, not on individual pet projects. But his words were cut off by Crockett's scornful laugh. Optimize. Sir, spending hundreds of millions on unnecessary projects isn't optimization. It's irresponsibility. She flipped a page in her documents, her voice sharpening. Let me list them. $400 million to refurbish a Qatari plane into a new Air Force One. $40 million for a parade in Washington, D.C., just to stroke the president's ego. And $1 billion for a military campaign in Yemen. Yet a week later, missile attacks on Israel continued. You call these priorities? The hearing room buzzed with soft whispers. A Republican lawmaker tried to interject in protest, but Chairman James Comer tapped his gavel, signaling for order. Hegseth clenched his fists, his eyes flashing with anger. Those expenditures were necessary to bolster America's image and strength, he said, his voice trembling. We made strategic choices to protect national interests. Crockett shook her head, her eyes full of disdain. National interests? Sir, when you spend billions on frivolous projects, what did you cut? Support for veterans, military training, or programs to protect the country from real threats, like China? She held up a report from an independent oversight organization, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. This report shows you diverted funds from essential programs to finance these projects. I have a specific story. A veteran named Raymond Booker, who lost medical support because of budget cuts. What do you have to say to people like him? Hegseth opened his mouth, but only a sigh escaped. We had to make tough choices, he replied, his voice weak and unconvincing. The budget isn't unlimited, and we prioritized what was necessary. Tough choices? Crockett interrupted, her voice like a surging wave. Tough is when veterans have to wait in line for health care. Tough is when soldiers aren't properly trained due to budget shortages. But you chose to spend money on a flashy plane and a meaningless parade. She stepped closer to the podium, her eyes blazing. Do you know that our allies are losing faith in America's leadership because of decisions like these? You've wasted American taxpayers' money, and you don't even have a plan to fix it. Hegseth tried to respond, his voice turning sharp. You're distorting the truth. Those expenditures were to strengthen our position internationally. I'm not here to be interrogated about strategic decisions, but his defense only stirred the audience further. With a few chuckles rising from the back rows, Crockett didn't flinch. She placed her hand on the podium, her voice slowing, each word like a hammer strike. Mr. Hegseth, your job is to protect the country, not throw parties for the president. When you missed the budget deadline, you put Congress in a bind, delaying funding for new weapons programs, military training, and border security. Do you know what that means? It means you've placed politics above national security. She paused, letting the statement sink deep into everyone's minds. The audience erupted in applause. Despite Comer's gavel taps, Hegseth bowed his head, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes wavering between anger and despair. The cameras zoomed in, capturing his face, a man once proud on television now looking cornered. Crockett stood there, unmoving, her gaze fixed on him, like a prosecutor delivering irrefutable evidence. You owe the American people an apology, she concluded, her voice commanding. And more than that, you owe them a defense secretary. Lowe can do the job. In the House Oversight and Accountability Committee hearing room, the air seemed to thicken. Jasmine Crockett stood there, her eyes burning like a warrior preparing to deliver the final blow. After exposing Hegseth's failures on Ukraine aid, his weak leadership, and his budget waste, she had him cornered. Hegseth, now looking like a trapped man, tried to maintain composure, but the sweat on his forehead and his wavering eyes betrayed his panic. The audience held their breath, sensing the decisive moment approaching. The television cameras panned slowly across the faces of the two figures, capturing the peak tension of this confrontation. Crockett took a deep breath, her voice slow but powerful, like a prosecutor preparing to present undeniable evidence. Mr. Hegseth, we've discussed your failures as defense secretary, but now we'll delve into a more serious issue, your lack of integrity. She held up a brown envelope, her eyes never leaving Hegseth. I have here an internal Pentagon document, provided by a courageous former employee. This document shows you diverted hundreds of millions in defense funds to a private contractor closely tied to President Trump's allies. Can you explain this action? The hearing room fell into a deathly silence. Republican lawmakers exchanged anxious glances, while Democrats sat up straighter, sensing the weight of the accusation. Hegseth's eyes widened, his voice trying to stay calm, but unable to hide a tremor. That's a baseless accusation, he replied, his voice higher than usual. I haven't engaged in any unethical actions. All contracts were thoroughly reviewed and served national interests. Crockett shook her head, her gaze icy and piercing through his defenses. Served national interests. Sir, this document tells a different story. She opened the envelope, pulling out a printed email from a private contractor's executive. This email, sent from a Triton defense executive, thanks you for securing a $300 million contract to develop an unnecessary weapons system, while military training programs were cut. Interestingly, this company is run by a longtime friend of President Trump. Is this a coincidence or a shady deal, Mr. Hegseth? The audience shuddered, whispers spreading. Chairman James Comer tapped his gavel, but the sound seemed swallowed by the tension. Hegseth gripped the table's edge, his voice turning sharp. You're trying to smear me and this administration. I have no personal dealings. Triton Defense is a reputable company, and that contract was approved through proper channels. Crockett leaned forward, her voice like a blazing fire. Reputable. Sir, Triton Defense had no history of producing weapons before receiving this contract, but they do have a history of donating millions of dollars to political campaigns tied to President Trump. She held up a financial report, her voice brimming with accusation. This report shows the company funneled $2 million into a super PAC supporting the president right after securing the contract. You want me to believe this wasn't a quid pro quo? The hearing room erupted in murmurs. A Democratic lawmaker in the back row clapped softly, while Republican lawmakers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. Hegseth tried to retort, but his voice faltered. I don't control Triton Defense's activities beyond the contract, he said, his words lacking conviction, like someone clinging to a punctured life raft. You're trying to create a story that doesn't exist. Crockett didn't let him off. She pulled out a third document, a recording from an internal Pentagon meeting, provided by a former Hegseth aide. I'd like to invite everyone to listen to a recording, she said, her voice calm but commanding. She pressed a button on a small device, and Hegseth's voice echoed through the speakers. We need to make sure Triton is prioritized. They're friends of the president, and that means they're our friends. The hearing room exploded, the audience's clamor forcing Comer to pound his gavel repeatedly. Hegseth paled, his eyes flickering between panic and anger. That recording, it's taken out of context, he shouted, jumping up from his seat. I did nothing wrong. This is a witch hunt. But his outburst only stirred the audience further, with a few mocking chuckles rising from the back rows. Crockett stood still, her gaze fixed on Hegseth, as if watching a trapped animal. Taken out of context, she asked, her voice lowering, each word like a knife. Sir, this recording shows you placed political interests above national security. You funneled American taxpayers' money into the hands of the undeserving, while our soldiers and veterans paid the price. She paused, letting the silence underscore her accusation. Do you have anything left to say to this country? Hegseth sank back into his seat, head bowed, with no further defense. The cameras zoomed in, capturing his face, a man once proud on television, now looking utterly defeated. The audience erupted in thunderous applause, despite Comer's gavel strikes. Democratic lawmakers exchanged triumphant glances, while Republicans sat silent, not daring to defend Hegseth. Crockett set the documents down, her voice ringing out like a final verdict. Mr. Hegseth, you're not just incompetent, you lack integrity, and this country cannot accept a defense secretary like that. She sat down, her eyes still locked on Hegseth, like a final challenge. The hearing room shook with applause, and Comer had to pound his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Hegseth, now a mere shadow of himself, sat motionless, knowing his career was crumbling before the nation's eyes. Jasmine Crockett stood there, her eyes blazing like a warrior, ready to deliver the decisive blow. After exposing Hegseth's failures on Ukraine aid, his weak leadership, and his budget waste, she had him cornered. Hegseth, looking like a trapped man, tried to maintain composure, but the sweat on his forehead and wavering eyes betrayed his panic. The audience held their breath, sensing the pivotal moment approaching. The television cameras panned slowly, capturing every emotional nuance on the faces of the two figures. Crockett took a deep breath, her voice calm but brimming with unstoppable force. Mr. Hegseth, we've seen your failures as defense secretary, but now I'll point out a more serious issue. Your lack of integrity. She held up a brown envelope, her eyes locked on Hegseth. I have an internal Pentagon document, provided by a courageous former employee. This document shows you diverted hundreds of millions in defense funds to a private contractor, closely tied to President Trump's allies. How do you explain this? The hearing room fell into a deathly silence. Republican lawmakers exchanged anxious glances, while Democrats sat up straighter, sensing the weight of the accusation. Hegseth's eyes widened, his voice trying to stay calm but unable to hide a tremor. That's a baseless accusation, he replied, his voice unnaturally high. I haven't violated any ethics. All contracts were thoroughly reviewed and served national interests. Crockett shook her head, her gaze icy and cutting through his defenses. Served national interests. This document tells a different story. She opened the envelope, pulling out a printed email from a private contractor's executive. This email, from a Triton defense executive, thanks you for securing a $300 million contract for an unnecessary weapons system, while military training programs were cut. Notably, this company is run by a longtime friend of President Trump. Is this a coincidence or a shady deal, Mr. Hegseth? The audience shuddered, whispers spreading. Chairman James Comer tapped his gavel, but the sound seemed swallowed by the tension. Hegseth gripped the table's edge, his voice sharp. You're smearing me and this administration. Triton Defense is a reputable company, and the contract was approved through proper channels. Crockett stepped forward, her voice like a blazing fire. Reputable. Triton Defense had no history of producing weapons before this contract, but they do have a history of donating millions to campaigns tied to President Trump. She held up a financial report, her voice full of accusation. This report shows the company funneled $2 million into a super PAC supporting the president right after securing the contract. You want me to believe this wasn't a quid pro quo? The hearing room buzzed with murmurs. A Democratic lawmaker clapped softly, while Republicans looked confused. Hegseth tried to respond, his voice faltering. I don't control Triton Defense's activities beyond the contract, he said, but his words lacked conviction, like someone clinging to a punctured life raft. You're creating a story that doesn't exist. Crockett didn't let him off. She pulled out another document, a recording from an internal Pentagon meeting, provided by a former Hegseth aide. I invite everyone to listen to a recording, she said, her voice calm but authoritative. She pressed a button, and Hegseth's voice echoed through the speakers. We need to prioritize Triton. They're friends of the president, and that means they're our friends. The hearing room exploded, the clamor forcing Comer to pound his gavel repeatedly. Hegseth paled, his eyes flickering between panic and anger. That recording, it's taken out of context, he shouted, jumping up. I did nothing wrong. This is a witch hunt. But his outburst only stirred the audience further, with mocking chuckles from the back rows. Crockett stood still, her gaze piercing Hegseth. Taken out of context? She asked, each word like a knife. This recording shows you placed political interests above national security. You funneled American taxpayers' money to the undeserving, while soldiers and veterans suffered. She paused, letting the silence underscore her accusation. Do you have anything left to say to this country? Hegseth sank back into his seat, head bowed, with no defense left. The cameras zoomed in, capturing his face, a man once proud on television, now defeated. The audience erupted in thunderous applause. Despite Comer's gavel strikes, Democrats exchanged triumphant glances, while Republicans sat silent, not daring to defend Hegseth. Crockett set the documents down, her voice ringing like a verdict. Mr. Hegseth, you're not just incompetent. You lack integrity. This country cannot accept a defense secretary like that. She sat down, her eyes still locked on Hegseth, like a final challenge. The hearing room shook with applause, and Comer had to pound his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Hegseth, a mere shadow of himself, sat motionless, knowing his career was crumbling before the nation's eyes. Crockett's confrontation had reached its peak, delivering an irreparable blow to his reputation. As the hearing broke, the hallways outside the Capitol became a frenzy. Reporters swarmed lawmakers, microphones raised, firing rapid questions about Hegseth's fate. A group of Democrats, led by Tammy Duckworth, huddled in a corner, discussing plans to push for a formal investigation. Duckworth, with a steely voice, told a reporter, "What Miss Crockett exposed today cannot be ignored. We need a defense secretary who puts the country first, not personal interests." Her words rang like a call to action, prompting nods from other lawmakers. Meanwhile, Republicans found themselves in a bind. Some, loyal to Trump, quietly left the hearing room, avoiding reporters' gazes. A veteran lawmaker, standing in the hallway, whispered to an aide, "Hegseth has become a liability." Their silence spoke volumes. Even Trump's supporters couldn't defend him after Crockett's irrefutable evidence. In a closed Pentagon meeting, Hegseth's aides scrambled to craft a response strategy, but their faces showed despair. A young aide, hands trembling, while holding a phone, muttered, "We can't turn this around." Inside the White House, the atmosphere was equally tense. In an emergency meeting, Trump's senior advisors argued fiercely over how to handle the crisis. One urged Trump to keep Hegseth to show resolve, but another, voice laden with worry, warned, "If we don't act, this will drag the whole administration down." Trump, known for loyalty to allies, initially resisted abandoning Hegseth, but as news channels replayed the recording, alongside images of Hegseth stumbling under Crockett's questioning, he began to waver. An insider source revealed that Trump, in a fit of anger, slammed the table and said, "Hegseth needs to handle this himself, or we'll handle him." At the Senate, pressure mounted. Senator Chuck Schumer, backed by Democratic allies, publicly called for the Pentagon's Inspector General to investigate Hegseth's conduct. In a brief press conference outside the Capitol, Schumer declared, "A defense secretary cannot put personal interests above national security. Mr. Hegseth must be held accountable." His call quickly gained support from veterans groups and government oversight organizations, who held small rallies outside the Pentagon, hoisting banners, demanding transparency. Hegseth, sensing the storm closing in, tried to salvage his position. He appeared on a friendly TV channel, but his effort only worsened things. When asked about the recording, he stammered, repeatedly claiming it was distorted, and I acted for the country's benefit. But viewers weren't convinced. The image of a faltering Hegseth, lacking his former Fox News confidence, only reinforced that Crockett had thoroughly defeated him. A TV commentator, right after the interview, remarked, "Hegseth looks like a man who knows his career is over." Meanwhile, Crockett became the center of attention. Democratic colleagues surrounded her after the hearing, praising her courage and sharpness. A veteran lawmaker, with a rare smile, told her, "You did what few dare to do, confront an entire system head-on." Crockett, though exhausted, remained resolute, replying simply, "I just did what was right." She left the hearing room, walking steadily, knowing her revelations would have far-reaching impact. The pressure finally became unbearable. In a brief phone call with Trump, Hegseth was asked to resign to protect the administration's image. Though bitter, he realized he had no other choice. On a quiet morning, he sent his resignation letter to the White House, claiming he was proud of what was accomplished, but making no mention of Crockett's accusations. The letter was broadcast on television, accompanied by images of Hegseth leaving the Pentagon, head bowed, avoiding reporters' cameras. In Texas, Crockett's supporters gathered at a community hall, watching the hearing replay on TV. They clapped each time she appeared, proudly calling her the Fire of Texas. Veterans groups sent thank you letters, commending her for standing up for their rights. In Washington, Democrats began drafting a bill to strengthen oversight of defense contracts, inspired by Crockett's victory. As news of Hegseth's resignation spread, the hearing room seemed to still echo with the power of Crockett's accusations. Cameras, now turned to evening news, replayed images of her standing at the podium, documents in hand, eyes unrelenting. Hegseth, once proud as a Trump loyalist, was now a mere shadow, his political career dissolved under the truth Crockett exposed. This confrontation wasn't just her personal triumph. It was a warning that no one, no matter how powerful, is above accountability. The political storm ignited by Jasmine Crockett showed no signs of subsiding, even as the House Oversight and Accountability Committee hearing room fell quiet. Pete Hegseth's resignation, a major blow to the Trump administration, sent shockwaves through Washington and the nation. Crockett, with her tenacity and precision, turned a hearing into a historic milestone, reaffirming the role of accountability in democracy. While Hegseth left the Pentagon in silence, Crockett emerged as a symbol of courage, an unquenchable fire in the hearts of those yearning for justice. In Texas, Crockett's hometown buzzed with pride. In a small Dallas community hall, locals gathered, eyes glued to the TV, as news replayed images of her standing tall against Hegseth. An elderly woman, once aided by Crockett as a public defender, wiped tears and said, "She's our voice." Others, from students to veterans, clapped whenever her name was mentioned. They saw in Crockett not just a congresswoman, but a warrior fighting for the forgotten, from veterans lacking medical support to soldiers impacted by the Pentagon's misguided decisions. In Washington, Crockett's legacy began to take shape. Democratic colleagues, from veterans to freshman lawmakers, regarded her with newfound respect. A young congressman, standing in the House hallway, whispered to a colleague, "Crockett showed us how to fight." She became an inspiration for a generation of lawmakers who realized that candor and solid evidence could topple even the most powerful figures. Government oversight organizations began advocating for new reforms, citing the Hegseth case as proof of the need for transparency in defense contracts. A bill named the Defense Accountability Act was drafted, inspired by Crockett's revelations, to ensure no defense secretary could misuse budgets without scrutiny. Hegseth, now a shadow of his former self, retreated from the political spotlight. He returned to old friends at Fox News, attempting to rebuild his image with fiery commentary, but his tone lacked its former confidence. Some sources suggested he considered running for Tennessee governor, but public memory remained haunted by images of him faltering under Crockett's questioning. His political career, once strongly backed by Trump, now seemed over, leaving a lesson that loyalty cannot mask incompetence or lack of ethics. At an event in Texas shortly after, Crockett stood before a crowd, her eyes shining but her voice gentle and sincere. "We don't fight for personal victories," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We fight to ensure this country serves its people, not the powerful." The crowd erupted in applause, from workers to military families, all feeling the strength in her words. She ended with a call, "Keep demanding the truth, because that's how we build a better future." Television cameras, now on evening news, preserved images of Crockett at the hearing podium, a woman unafraid to confront power. Her legacy wasn't just in toppling Hegseth, but in inspiring a movement for accountability. As the spotlight dimmed, Crockett continued her work, from the House to Texas communities, carrying the fire of determination that captivated the nation. The Hegseth affair wasn't just a victory. It was a reminder that in a democracy, no one stands above the truth. The story of the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Pete Hegseth in the hearing reflects deep issues in American society today, particularly political division and the urgent need for accountability. Crockett's exposure of Hegseth's misconduct, from halting Ukraine aid, firing military leaders, to diverting budgets for personal gain, underscores the importance of transparency in government. In today's context, as trust in public institutions wanes, this story reminds us that every individual, from ordinary citizens to lawmakers, has a duty to hold those in power accountable. Crockett's courageous actions, using concrete evidence like emails and recordings to confront Hegseth, show that truth, however difficult, is the most powerful tool against abuse of power. The lesson is clear: in everyday life, Americans must actively seek information, ask questions, and demand accountability from leaders, whether at the local or national level. For example, when Hegseth tried to justify wasteful spending like the Air Force One refurbishment, Crockett connected it directly to the harm done to veterans like Raymond Booker, a powerful call to prioritize core values like community support over short-term political gains. In American culture, where free speech and civic responsibility are cherished, this lesson encourages everyone to engage in public discourse, from voting to attending community meetings, to ensure figures like Hegseth cannot abuse power unchecked. Follow Crockett's example, Be resolute, well-prepared, and unafraid to speak out for justice. Subscribe to the channel to follow the journey of demanding accountability like Jasmine Crockett's. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue exploring stories of justice.